One of the craziest, most entertaining, most confounding trade deadlines ever is in the books, and I personally could not be more thrilled to be back and talking about it. Welcome to Chucking Darts, a podcast of informed, rigorous, reckless, harmless, speculative, and fun predictions about the game we love. You can call me Chuck. I think this is episode 220. I've been gone for about a month. Episode 219 was a draft episode about some of the Big Ten's best NBA prospects. Kasparas Yakashonis, Dylan Harper, Ace Bailey with Rutgers. That was with a Caleb Mueller of On the Clock and the Center Hub. I'm hopefully going to have him back to talk more about Derek Queen and Danny Wolf and Jace Richardson soon. But first of all, I've been gone for a few weeks, partially just due to work being busy, partially due to the fact that I got the flu and that knocked out my voice for an extended period of time. But I have some time now, and I didn't want to record as this deadline stuff was happening. I wanted to wait until it was over. And I am hopefully, again, schedule willing, going to have a guest on to really unpack where this leaves the league and the title picture moving forward. But when so many deals that are so insane happen, and I have some stuff that I want to get off my chest, I don't want to, burden a guest when I feel like I have so much to say and sort of steamroll their opinion. I don't want to do that. So this is going to be a solo episode where I just go through as many of these deals as I can without belaboring the point. And then I got a special segment at the very end about David Lynch. And this is going to be a first for Chucking Darts to talk about, film and film criticism in such depth. But Lynch was an important guy to me, and I want to touch on just a couple things about what makes him special to me. But that's for the end of the episode for the real freaks who want to get to that. For now, let's start with Luka Doncic and Anthony Davis. Okay, so if you're listening to this, chances are you've probably heard one podcast or 10 talk about this trade, and you've ingested, a lot of the initial shock, anger, confusion, criticism, just a lot of emotions wrapped up in this deal. I experienced some of that myself. Shout out to my buddy Judge Dirk. He affectionately named that, but he's one of my best friends. He's been on this podcast before. He's a huge Mavericks fan, and he's been sort of going through his stages of grief. Shout out to Mavericks fans who are just trying to find a way to process what has just happened to them and their franchise. But as far as this trade goes, the way that I want to talk about it is acknowledge its simplicity because trades don't really get much more simple than this. It's very rare that a team trades its best player while the team is good in order to presumably get better, which is what Nico Harrison did on behalf of the Dallas Mavericks. There are conspiracy theories out there about Las Vegas and depressing the franchise value and blah, blah, blah. I'm going to leave all of that to the side because I can't speak on that with any sort of insight, number one. And number two, I'm a the simplest answer is usually the correct one kind of guy. And the simplest answer here, and what Nico Harrison said, is that essentially he is doing what he believes is best to get the Dallas Mavericks closest to winning an NBA title. That's what he thought. And so we will get to the ancillary parts of this, Max Christie and that pick in a minute. But at a very, very core level, he thought that Anthony Davis was better for the Dallas Mavericks to win an NBA championship than Luka Doncic. And I want to break that down into two and eventually three different questions, which is number one, was Nico Harrison correct? Well, really, the overall question is, was Nico Harrison correct at any stage of his evaluation executing this deal? Because the evaluation and the execution of the trade is sort of a three-pronged deal. The first prong is Nico Harrison decided the Dallas Mavericks were not going to win an NBA title with Luka Doncic. The second prong is they have a better chance of winning one with Anthony Davis. And the third prong is this specific deal was the correct deal to get, having decided questions 1 and 2. So let's start with him saying that, I mean, essentially, that the Dallas Mavericks are not going to win a title with Luka Doncic. Obviously, obviously, Luka, they could be a title contender with Luka because they were in the NBA Finals last year, and Luka's only 25, and he's only going to get better than that. And so for Nico to decide that they were not going to win a title is basically him saying that not only was last year basically as good as it was ever going to get with Luka, but that there are some endemic flaws within Luka's game that's going to prevent them from ever being better than last year. And I will say straight away that I don't agree with him having made this trade. Of course, I don't agree with him having made this trade. However, I do want to explore the thought process and sort of break down the ways in which I disagree and sort of figure out how strongly I disagree with each part of the process. So as far as the Luka part, um, they traded for PJ Washington and Daniel Gafford at the deadline last year. With all that's happened with that organization, it seems like those guys have been on the team for longer than they have, but it's only been 1 calendar year. And in the very short time that they were together, they went to the NBA Finals. So obviously, you can make a very easy, sound case that the Dallas Mavericks had not peaked with the current version of the team and that they were going to get better the more they played with each other. And I think that is ultimately the correct answer, and a reason why for Harrison to decide that Luka was just not going to get it done for them was a premature decision that really lacked sound logic. However, I will say that, is it possible that Luka was never going to win a title with Dallas? Sure. Very few teams win the title. Very few players win Finals MVP. I think Luka was good enough to be in that inner circle, but lots of players are good enough to win Finals MVP and never actually do it. From a pure sort of odds point of view, the odds are against really any team being favored to ever win the title. So could it be that Harrison deciding that Luka wasn't going to be the guy, could that have been right? Yes, it could have been. Harrison went on this whole thing about defense winning championships, and I'm going to get to that more when I talk about Anthony Davis in a minute. But he clearly thought that there was something both with Luka's defensive effort and with his overall durability and conditioning that just rubbed him the wrong way. I personally think that even if Harrison was trying to do the best job that he could, if he was trying to come by that conclusion honestly, um, you know, I don't really think it's an accident that he's been attracted to Kyrie, to Anthony Davis, to Kevin Durant. They tried to throw something together for haphazardly this week. All of that to me is Nico having a tradition and a history in building relationships among highly regarded American-born youth players. Derek Lively was the #1 high school recruit. He would fit into this as well. And it would not shock me if Nico had some sort of a thought that, some sort of outdated Euros or soft kind of thought about all of this. I mean, I guess maybe he could say he offered Luka for, Giannis, and maybe that cuts against that. But Giannis is also like obviously a super athlete, and Luka is obviously not a super athlete. So I I think that there was something about Luka just not being the style of player that Nico Harrison usually likes. And that's a bias, and that's bad. And biases lead you to make catastrophic decisions if you lean into them too hard. But every GM has some sort of bias to something. Every evaluator has some sort of bias to something. So I'm not going to say that like Nico should be raked over the coals for potentially having a bias or for making a bad call. He should just be held accountable if this backfires, which I think it has a strong chance to. But as far as Luka's defense and his conditioning go, there is like, I know he played the most minutes in the league last year, and I know that Luka plays hurt. and he can play hurt and still play hurt well. But it's fine to acknowledge that I mean, there should be a bit of concern about how he comes into seasons out of shape and has to play himself into shape and all of that. Not enough, in my opinion, to do this trade, but there's enough to have a concern about it. And I think what I've heard in the aftermath of the deal is like, well, now he's going to get to be about around LeBron, and LeBron's going to teach him how to invest in his body and stay healthy. And maybe all of that is true. That'd be great. It's possible. But I don't think that the reason Luka would come in to NBA seasons out of shape was because he just hadn't had enough conversations with LeBron. I think Luka had all the information available to him to know what was a good and healthy choice for his body and what wasn't. And he just kept coming in out of shape. And so might that bite him as injuries pile up and he gets a little bit older? Perhaps. Perhaps. There's a thought, I guess, that because he hasn't entered what most players when most players experience their prime, he's 25, most players hit their prime 27, 28 through maybe 31, 32. That's usually the prime for most guys. That he's just going to get better. And I think, again, you could just make the case that Luka is going to get better. But it's also true that if you get injured a lot as a young player, then your whatever athleticism you have is going to start to go a little bit earlier than it does for other guys. And Luka has not had any catastrophic injury yet. And so I don't want to be alarmist about that either. But if he doesn't, it's not like he's Jokic. Jokic would come in out of shape, but he'd also just never get hurt and he would play all the time. And he would play this very kind of athletically safe brand of ball because he didn't need to be flying around the perimeter all the time. With Luka, there is going to be some demand on him to up his perimeter activity on defense if he wants to really win a title. I do think he needs to get a little bit better at that. I think it's possible, but I also think that is also going to strain his body a little. And so it's okay to acknowledge some concern as to how his body will react to that if he continues to not take care of it in the offseason. It's okay to acknowledge. However, like I said before, very few players win finals MVP to begin with. I wrote a piece that I think is probably still on my Substack before the 2023 playoffs, the one the Nuggets won, about the recent history of finals MVPs and what they share in common and how to identify them. And Luke, like I broke it down basically into two categories, which is guys who can overwhelm on both sides of the ball, which think like LeBron or, young Kawhi, or I guess Raptors Kawhi. Or Giannis, when he won in Milwaukee. These are two-way monster forces. Then there's another certain kind of player that can really thrive on offense, really, really thrive, which is, Steph Curry or Jokic or something like that. And then they just survive on defense. They are sort of just good enough, but the offense is really emanating from them. They're really supplying it and, winning these close games down the stretch. Luka would, of course, be in the latter category because he's not going to overwhelm anyone athletically. And even though you can probably find a statistical model saying the odds are against Luka ever winning Finals MVP, that's only because the odds are always against anyone. Like no one again is ever going to be favored over 50% to win that at the start of any regular season. So if Luka's not going to lead it to you or like win Finals MVP, someone has to. And the idea that Luka was such an unlikely Finals MVP winner that you should make this trade in favor of Anthony Davis is just wrong. It's just wrong. And I'll use this to transition into Anthony Davis, but if you look around the league, you could say maybe like SGA has a great chance to be a Finals MVP. Okay. You could say Wembanyama has a great chance down the line to be Finals MVP. Okay. But nothing is certain with those guys either. You know, SGA thrives on hitting pretty difficult shots for anybody else. And if those shots ever get really difficult in the playoffs, we haven't seen him in a conference finals yet. Wembanyama hasn't made the finals yet. And, he could get hurt, I guess. His case is a little bit more attractive than probably SGA's is. But the point is, you could pick nits with anyone. And Luka has already shown repeatedly in the playoffs how well his stuff translates. And you could say, well, Helio Ball usually isn't awarded in the playoffs, blah, blah, blah. This was all stuff Luka was figuring out. He was figuring out his diet of on the ball versus off the ball. He was figuring out when and where to pick his spots defensively. And that's why you need to give a team that was as good as Dallas was last year. And I think they were like 10-1 or something this year when their normal starting five were healthy. Kyrie, Luka, Clay, PJ, Lively. Like you have to give that more time. Like I know it's ironic coming from me, this sort of, chucking darts, which is about getting ahead of trends and identifying where the league is going and making predictions and moves based off that. But any team that wins the title has to play together a lot to develop the chemistry to win the title. And that team in Dallas last year was real. I mean, they beat OKC as a lower seed, and then they beat Minnesota, who, had this great defense and had just knocked off Denver. They got through that West. That was no cheap route. And like, it really, it saddens me to have such a cool team revolving around Luka broken up prematurely. They may never have won a title. It may never have happened. But the job was largely done. It was just a matter of getting all those guys to play together. Clay had looked, I thought, pretty good. Najee Marshall was a very good acquisition as a wing on the bench. I picked Dallas to make the finals again before the season. It's before Luka got hurt, but Luka's going to be back in a week and he's going to start doing his thing again. And so to conclude that just Luka was not going to be the guy when he's still young, yes, there's injury concerns. Yes, there's conditioning concerns. Yes, the league is full of great competition, but he had put together a resume that had earned him more time. So, for all of those reasons, I think Harrison was certainly wrong to essentially write Luka off, which is what he did. Now, I mentioned there that you can acknowledge the concerns that Harrison probably had, even if you don't agree with them in him making his choice. The second phase here about deciding that Anthony Davis does give them a better chance is, to me, where Harrison is even wronger, so to speak. And like, I don't want to make it sound like I don't think Anthony Davis is a great player, because Anthony Davis is a great player, but Nico Harrison said defense wins championships when he actually deigned to speak to reporters before he's gone into hiding and acting like, his life's in danger, which is ridiculous. But he said defense wins championships, and Anthony Davis is a great defensive player. And that's the 1+1 that he added in his brain to equal 2. We need great defense, and Anthony Davis is a great defender. Therefore, we will have great defense. And first of all, Dallas's defense was really good last year in the playoffs. Again, you don't make the finals through a West like that, going through largely a healthy OKC team and a healthy Minnesota team without having a very good defense. They defended SGA very, very well in that series and used sort of OKC's conservative passing scheme against them. They played, Minnesota has sort of a blueprint on how to defend them, but Mavs executed that as well. So the idea that they just had to take a step back on offense to really beef up their defense is what Harrison was betting on. And I cannot be clear enough about this. That is not where the NBA is going. That defense wins championships is an adage all of you have probably heard since you were 5 years old. And there's a reason that you've heard it for so long. And it's not because it's unequivocally true, it's because it's an axiom that sounds nice that is passed down from decade to decade. You do need to have good defense to win the NBA title. You can't be terrible at it. But where the league is going is having an offense that is so hard to stop that you force any defense to make very difficult choices and you still generate good looks. And this is, of course, why Luka was, a perennial MVP candidate, was and is, and why he was so good in the playoffs last year. It sounds obvious and reductive, but it's true. If you generate good shots against anybody, your team is going to have a very good chance of winning. I said, I think on Jack Quantrill's podcast, The Drop Step, that defense wins championships axiom is in conflict with another axiom everyone's heard for decades in the NBA, which is great offense beats great defense. Well, which is it? If great offense beats great defense and defense wins championships, those are sort of conflicting ideas. And the truth of the matter is that great offense beats great defense. That is the axiom that is more true. I mean, it's been borne out by this wave of offensive sophistication over the last 10 or so years. Again, the teams that win still play good defense, but they have an offense that can generate shots in any situation. And it's just basic logic if anyone's ever played one-on-one. A defender can do something, they can do everything right, and if the shot goes up above their hand, it has a chance of going in. If it's executed well enough, it will. So Nico seems to think that the Mavericks have enough offense as presently constituted because he believes so strongly in, Kyrie Irving, or maybe he really likes, that Clay can still get those threes up. And maybe he thinks that Anthony Davis is this really, really gifted offensive player. And he is gifted. But Davis has, throughout his career, never really shown the capacity to be the primary offensive option on any good team. That's never really happened. I mean, he did win an NBA title, but he played off of LeBron, who was a much better offensive player, was and still is a much better offensive player than he is. And it should be noted, Anthony Davis won that title in the bubble, which is not worth an asterisk for it being easier. It wasn't easier. But shooting percentages in the bubble were up across the board, including Anthony Davis's jump shooting percentage. It was better in the bubble than it ever was. And so I think one of the effects of the bubble is that for defensively tilted players or really blessed defensive players, it made them even more effective because their offense, which ordinarily might have been a weakness or a drawback, was probably propped up a little bit. And I think that probably had something to do with how well Anthony Davis played in the bubble. If you remember, he hit I think they were up 1-0 against the Nuggets in the conference finals in that bubble, and he hit like a movement three as time expired to win game 2 and really sort of put the Lakers way out in front in that series. And if that was a full crowd, even if it was in LA, I doubt he hits that jumper. But that's to say that the Mavericks are still going to have to figure out how to generate really good looks against really good defenses. And the way the league is gone, unless and until they change that 3-point line, you need to get threes up, a lot of them, in order to win. And they currently have Clay, an old Clay, but they're going to be playing Anthony Davis next to a center a lot because they have two good centers and they can't not play him. Even if Anthony Davis tries to close at 5, that is at best a misallocation of resources, meaning they made this trade and now they're going to have to trade Lively or Gafford to get someone else, which is, again, just sort of, I'm trying to think of the right metaphor, but cutting off your nose and then cutting off your ear to spite your nose, which spited your face. And if they don't do that, and they play him with a center like Anthony Davis has said he's excited about, and like Nico has said he's excited about, they're not going to get enough threes up to win these games. They're not. The math will not be in their favor. And I know that Clay's a great shooter. I know that Kyrie's a great shooter. PJ can be a great shooter from the corners, but he's not going to be in the corners as much with as much space since Anthony Davis is good and whatever center there is are going to be cramping the space a little bit. And they can gin up whatever they can using Anthony Davis and DHO or trying to, maybe some snug pick and rolls, 4-5s that he can run with a center. It's not as though their offense is going to be affirmatively bad. It's that it is very likely that they are going to struggle to put up great shots against very good defenses, and the offense is going to dry up. And the only case I can think of against that to where this might work would be to look at how the Cleveland Cavaliers play and succeed. Because they play two bigs together a lot. They also spend, half the time with either Mobley at 5 or Allen at 5 and the other off the floor. I imagine the Mavs will gravitate towards a similar model, except now they have 3 bigs that are worth playing, not just 2. But they'll have a healthy split of AD at the 5 and AD at the 4. And Cleveland makes it work. They're the best team in the East so far this year, and they're headed towards being favored in the first 2 rounds of the playoffs. And if chalk holds, then they'll play, the Celtics in the conference finals or maybe the Knicks or something. And so they're clearly a title contender without necessarily having ideal spacing. But the difference between the Cavs and the Mavs are that, number one, Evan Mobley was drafted in 2021. He's still on the way up. Anthony Davis is over 30. And the team has this is their 3rd season, I believe, with Donovan Mitchell. So they've gotten a lot of those reps together. Mobley is used to playing with Allen. Allen is used to playing either with Mobley or without him, with Mitchell running pick and roll or with Garland running pick and roll. They've gotten used to all these different configurations with each other. And Mobley and Allen are both really sort of blessed passers. Lively is as good or better a mover around the floor as Jared Allen is. He's also bigger and sort of a better defensive talent than Jared Allen. He's not a better defender today, but he could be a better defender down the road. Lively is a piece that could fit in sort of a Cavs-esque offense in Dallas. But Davis coming in the middle of a season like this, I do not see how he's going to be able to develop the requisite chemistry playing next to Lively to sort of get the passing reps down to where they can function so fluidly as the Cavs do. Couple that with the fact that the Cavs have a lot of guys who can handle the ball, from Garland to Mitchell. Recently, Karis LeVert, though he was, traded for DeAndre Hunter. But, Ty Jerome can dribble and attack. Strus can dribble and attack a little bit. And in Dallas, the ball handlers are Kyrie and Jaden Hardy, I guess. I mean, Clay is largely a spot-up shooter now. PJ is maybe like 1 or 2 dribbles and pass, but he's not running pick and roll. In Cleveland, all of that ball handling, I did an episode with Mike Gribanoff about them early in the season when it was clear that they were a force to be reckoned with. And we talked about how having all of those ball handlers on the floor can help alleviate that spacing concern a little bit, because you're constantly getting into the paint so much off of driving kicks that the defense is going to keep collapsing. And that's a way to generate good looks. It's a way to increase your spacing. And with Davis, not only is he not like a sophisticated pick and roll operator, but he's been a little bit of a ball stopper in his career. He likes to size up his defender on the baseline or from the perimeter and see if he can execute a blow by or go into a post up. And stuff just grounds to a halt. It's not that he's a bad offensive player because he's still a monster finisher off of someone else's passes or gravity. And he can still execute good passes as a hub. But these margins just matter so much. The ability to generate good looks matters so much. And I can like before the Luka version of this team, you could make an argument that in any matchup except for maybe Denver, that they were going to generate better looks than any team down the stretch in the Western Conference. But now with like a 34-year-old Kyrie Irving, a Kyrie Irving who has, not been the picture of durability himself. He hasn't been durable. Clay hasn't been durable. Anthony Davis hasn't been durable. These are the guys they're investing in offensively now. But with Kyrie being the main guy off the dribble for that team, he's another guy who thrives on just super difficult shots a lot. And so now in a matchup, not only will Denver generate better looks than them, but the Lakers will certainly generate better looks than them now. Oklahoma City will generate better looks than them now. In short order, San Antonio is going to end up generating better looks than them probably by next season, if not this one. And all these other teams, Memphis with a lot of gravity and having that big, threat in Edie down low and playing Jaren Jackson at the 5 and being able to space 5 out. Like Jaren Jackson's a much better shooter than Anthony Davis. They'll be able to generate better looks than Dallas. And they're just going to start falling into the middle of the pack in terms of how good their average look is and their average crunch time look is. Yes, their defense is going to be good. It will be. They have a lot of good defensive personnel. They've got a lot of positional size. Davis is still a really good defender, but you look no further than their series against Jokic. Anthony Davis could get numbers, but Denver in those series, even though they were competitive series recently, the last couple of years, they just generated better looks down the stretch in those games consistently than the Lakers did. All of Anthony Davis's defensive pedigree didn't amount to much when it came to crunch time in those games and when it came to stopping a guy like Jokic. It could mean something if he's switched on to SGA potentially, maybe. But, wouldn't you just rather have the team that beat the Thunder, the 1 seed last year, and that had been 3-0 against them this year, which is what the Mavs were? It's just, I would like for it to work with Davis. That'd be a great story. I like Max Christie. I liked him a lot, frankly, after seeing him in 2023 Summer League after his first season in the NBA. And I wrote that I thought he was due for a breakout last season in LA. And then I guess it finally had started to happen the last few weeks as he distanced himself from Dalton Connect in their starting lineup. I like that he's unafraid to operate off the dribble a little bit. He looks like a pretty solid mirror defender, not like a big playmaker, not a guy who's going to get a lot of deflections, steals, blocks, etc. But he looks like someone who can potentially be a solid like fourth starter. I mean, it's a good player to have. And the team is still going to have some, a pretty solid depth. Exum's back now. Hopefully he stays healthy. But, they're Caleb Martin, if he ever debuts, is going to be another player. We can get to that Grimes deal later. But it's a lot of guys who are built to revolve around a better player. Even Anthony Davis, he has revolved around LeBron recently. The teams that win, except maybe with the exception of Boston last year, have all had an offensive player to really revolve around a little bit. It doesn't make them heliocentric, but there is a hierarchy and there is a guy who can generate his own looks. Tatum is that in Boston, but they were very egalitarian last year and they always played 5 out and they got a ton of threes up and they always sort of like played a favorable mathematical brand of ball. Like I said before, the Mavs cannot play a mathematical brand of ball with Davis playing next to a 5. They can't do it. I don't think they can mimic the Cavs in the way they make it work because they don't have the ball handlers to get into the paint frequently enough. Davis isn't as gifted a passer as Mobley, and they can't generate the reps to build the chemistry. And so, as to this second question of whether or not Davis is now a guy that gives them a better chance at the title, or like a good chance at the title, or now they have a guy they need in order to win the title, absolutely not. I'm not going to favor him to win a playoff series this year. We'll see where the league stands next year. I don't think they're sort of removed from the conversation of a top 6 seed, but you know, they've thrown away what I thought was for sure like a constant like top 4 team in the West into the absolute muck and mire of the Western Conference. And that brings me to the third question, which is the way the deal was executed. So if Nico was wrong about Luka and wronger about Anthony Davis, he is wrongest about the way he went about it. And this is like the most self-evident of the 3 questions because none of what he said about it made any sense. He kept, he's like, if I shopped Luka around, then it might make him mad and he might try to dictate where he wants to go. Well, like, okay, that's what being a general manager is. You do have to deal with star players who are going to dictate where they want to go. If you communicate to them that you don't want them here, you do have to sort of manage that relationship then and still do what's best for the team. And still, if Luka were going to make it uncomfortable, you still likely would have gotten a lot better than what you got around Anthony Davis, meaning Christie and a pick, because some other team would have offered something. Nico Harrison didn't know that Luka was only going to demand one team. That still is not a thing. That's something that Nico invented in his mind as a concern. Luka could have given him a list of 5 teams, could have given him a list of 10 teams. He was not the one who asked out. He could have come to Nico and they could have sat down and talked, and maybe Luka and his agent could have convinced Nico that to not be an idiot and give the team a chance. There were infinite ways where this could have been avoided or a better deal could have materialized if Nico just cared to look. But he didn't. He went by his gut. And a couple years ago, when they traded Porzingis at the trade deadline in 2022, it was very similar. Now, Porzingis was probably shopped maybe a little bit more at the time, but like with Luka, Nico decided he wasn't going to be a good enough sort of defensive piece to win a title with. See where, how that's been proven incorrect. He decided that he just sort of wanted out of the Porzingis business. And so he traded him at the deadline when there was a limited number of suitors, as opposed to waiting till the offseason when there are no traditional quote unquote sellers and the market's going to be much wider. And he traded him for Spencer Dinwiddie and he threw in a pick and he got like no pick value really for Kristaps Porzingis. He sold as low as he possibly could to as barren a market as he could possibly enter. Now, he ended up not getting much criticism for that trade because Dinwiddie happened to play incredibly well for Dallas, and they made the Western Conference Finals in 2022. So everyone sort of forgot the haphazard way in which he went about shipping off Kristaps Porzingis. But I wrote at the time, like they just left 2 or 3 picks worth of value on the table. If they'd waited till the summer, they would have gotten more draft picks. And since Nico's been there, they let Jalen Brunson just walk and didn't offer him 4 for 56 because he wasn't a Nico Harrison kind of player. They traded Porzingis during the season instead of the offseason and lost out on pick value because he wasn't a Nico Harrison kind of player. And they shipped Luka Doncic, of all players, without shopping him because Nico decided it was more important to just get out of the Luka business because he wasn't a Nico Harrison kind of player. These are the tendencies that you need to pay attention to if you have a GM who's got them. Because this is a guy in Harrison who trusts his instincts, which every GM has to do, but he does not do his due diligence in these deals. And that's the problem. You can trust your instincts all you want, but it can't come at the expense of due diligence. And that is what he has done repeatedly. He has not done his due diligence. And, Zach Lowe also, how great was that to hear Zach come back on the airwaves? He mentioned, he just threw out, he's like, Franz Wagner and 4 first-round picks. Would Orlando have done that? Yeah, they would have had a conversation about it, possibly. I get that Nico probably doesn't love draft picks and probably doesn't care about the draft that much. I get it. They did a good job to get Derek Lively. And so maybe he thinks the draft picks are, fuddy-duddy and they don't matter, even though they obviously do. But the idea that he didn't think harder about this and that he was just locked into Anthony Davis, probably because he built a relationship with Anthony a decade ago or longer, that's another bias, is that Nico fell in love with Anthony Davis at a young age, and he just decided that he was not going to interrogate the rest of the league or explore it for other offers. And that is just what is just on top of all of this, is that Dallas could have a really attractive, trading Luka, as bad as that is likely to turn out for them, could have set their timeline back and still given them a very attractive young core of players to still grow with. Now, who are they growing with? Derek Lively, PJ Washington a little bit. Now the team, Kyrie, Clay, Anthony Davis, these guys are on the wrong side of 30. And they don't have the offensive juice. And so not only have they taken a team that was, in my opinion, a title contender this season and removed them from that conversation, but they're likely not going to be a part of the conversation next year. And the long-term future of the team is completely unsettled. Not a clear direction of where it's going. And I know there are rumors that Nico doesn't even want to be GM for more than 3 or 5 years. Whatever. Again, that is searching for sort of ulterior motives here, and I'm not really going to investigate any of that. But it's just really, really upsetting that Harrison, even if his focus was for the short term, didn't do enough diligence to even get it right by that account. And so that's sort of how I feel. There's wrong, which is saying that Luka's not going to be that guy. But it's at least understandable to have concerns, and maybe Luka never will win a title. But it's wrong to just say, I have to trade him right now. It's wronger to say that Anthony Davis is that guy. And it's wrongest in the way he went about it. And that's why Nico finds himself humiliated and having to engage in pretty distasteful, PR spin to say that, the fans are reacting inappropriately in a way that makes me fear for myself. Like, get over yourself, man. Get over yourself. If you couldn't foresee the backlash that you were going to face, then you don't have the insight to be a GM. And I believe he did foresee it, because I think that's probably why he wanted to keep it quiet, is he didn't want to have to deal with all this backlash. If you did foresee it, then deal with it. It's part of the job. So that's that trade. It'd be nice if that was really the only signature trade of this deadline. It's certainly the one that the deadline's going to be remembered for. But as it happens, there were other really significant deals made. So I will get to Jimmy Butler and Golden State in a moment, but I'm going to talk about the trade for DeAndre Hunter that the Cavs did, which was like 3 second-round picks, Karis LeVert, George Niang, I think, for Hunter. And The reason I'm saying that is because I compared the Cavs to the Mavs earlier, and this acquisition of Hunter reminds me of the acquisition that Dallas made for PJ Washington last year's deadline, which I praised at the time, where I said, essentially Dallas is managing to get bigger at each position while without sacrificing their offensive talent and versatility. And you saw in the playoffs that, PJ really helped guard SGA, but they still generated really good looks. They hadn't sacrificed any of that because they still had Luka. Same with, acquiring Gafford and making sure they had a lob threat for 48 minutes. Hunter, they obviously, the Cavs have enjoyed a vertical threat because they have Mobley and Allen. And Hunter versus LeVert, the biggest thing about it is not that Hunter is this amazing defender. He's fine, but he's like Max Christie. He's always been more of a mirror defender, someone who can just sort of kind of stay in front and bother someone rather than overwhelm them defensively. But the biggest thing is that he's just bigger, which means their rebounding is going to be a little bit better. It means their ground coverage on defense is going to be a little bit crisper. And he's a better shooter. Their offense should be better with them. And they already had, if not the number one offense in the NBA, maybe it fell to number 2 or number 3 by now. So the Cavs made themselves harder to guard while making themselves sort of a more, at least on paper, a better defensive team. Doesn't mean that they're like DeAndre Hunter is a stopper. He's never really been a stopper. He's now a better offensive player than he is a defensive one because of how well he's been shooting threes. But anytime you have a wingspan like that and you can cover ground, which he can, it means you can do a decent job defensively. You're not gonna be chum in the water for anybody. You might still get beat, but you're not gonna be chum in the water. And as long as you can hold your own a little bit against the Tatums of the world or whatever, then you just let Cleveland's offense, of which you are a part, do the rest and hope that offense carries you home and hope that the ground coverage that Cleveland's going to have in defending the 3-point line against Boston, should it ever come down to that matchup, or against New York, should it ever come down to that matchup, is good enough to where your opponent's 3-point percentage starts to come back to earth a little bit. Because if there's one thing about Boston, they really rely on 3-point volume a lot. They aren't really super sophisticated in how they generate those threes. It's sort of simple and effective, but if you can run them off the line a lot, they're not going to have a lot of counters for you. So I think that Cleveland, I will save it again. I got to digest it more as to who I actually favor in the East, but I thought it was a very wise trade. You lose a little bit of ball handling with LeVert. Good passer, good driver. But to me, it was worth the upgrade in the areas that I mentioned. So I liked it for them. I really did. And now between Hunter, Strus, Okoro, Wade, they can go with a big wing at the 3, or they could go with Hunter and Wade at the 4 when one of Mobley or Allen is off, without really sacrificing anything anywhere else. If they wanted to tilt a defensive lineup, they can play sort of Okoro at 2 and Strus at the 3 and have one of Garland and Mitchell on the floor with them. If they wanted to tilt towards offense, they would have Garland and Mitchell on the floor together, have Hunter or Wade at the 4 and have Strus at the 3. If they want to go for, maximum balance, then you'd have Mobley and Allen 4-5, Hunter at 3, and then Garland and Mitchell at 2. It's a deep team. That will mess you up in a lot of different ways. So very excited to see how that goes. We'll talk about Butler to the Warriors, and Andrew Wiggins, Kyle Anderson, Davion Mitchell, and the Warriors' first-round pick this coming draft, I believe, to Miami. I think that, first of all, the whole Butler drama, I don't really care about. I think all that, it's fun for sort of daytime talking head shows. but I think it's all very silly. Butler, a frustrating guy, I'm sure, in some respects, but still a very, very good player when he plays. Pat Riley's thing about him was that he wasn't playing enough last year. That's what ruffled his feathers. Maybe he feels insulted by that because of all the success Miami's had in the playoffs when he's there in the Eastern Conference, but it is true that he hasn't played that much recently. And though a lot of his missed games recently have been due to his suspension, you know, there's no guarantee that had he not been not been suspended, that he'd be playing every game anyway. That's this really comes down to with him on Golden State. He will find ways to play well with Steph because any smart player is going to play well with Steph, and Butler's a very, very smart player. Um, but like anything, you're going to have to generate the reps to build the chemistry to really execute all your stuff super well. There's going to be a sort of baseline of uh, spacing concerns between Butler and Draymond and Steph. They have more counters for it because if you have Draymond as a hub and you have Butler and Steph cutting off of that, or if you have Butler with the ball and you have Draymond and Steph setting a double screen for him, there's going to be lots of stuff a defense has to pay attention to. And I think the Warriors could be quite good. It's just that there's also, if you play a team that switches well enough, and the Warriors sooner or later will run into a team that switches well enough, you're still going to be sort of devolving into a lot of one-on-one ball if you're the Warriors offense. That still will happen. And the Warriors have struggled with switching defenses in the past who can sort of help contain Steph off the ball and keep everybody in front of them. So that's what I'm interested to see, is how they are going to beat a switching defense. But at a base level, they're going to be dangerous this year in the first round of the playoffs if they get that far against one of these higher seeds that maybe, I don't know if I would favor them against Memphis or Houston or OKC or anything like that. But they will be able to likely generate stuff late, and they'll likely still play pretty good defense. Golden State's been a good defensive team for a long time. And though I'm a little hesitant about Butler, Kuminga, and Draymond all on the floor at the same time, they clearly still have good defensive personnel. One thing this trade kind of illuminated for me that I hadn't realized is that they had Kevin Durant, who's a 7-footer, and he's Kevin Durant, but they haven't had a true blue shooting center with Steph in like maybe ever. Draymond plays the 5 and he'll take threes, but I mean like a guy who's a weapon out there. And it's just crazy to me that they just never have had that guy. That's just wild. And you would think with Steph Curry that, what a weapon that would be. But they still don't have that, which means that if Draymond is ever not playing the 5 and he's playing the 4, and it's Trace Jackson Davis that they have on the floor or something like that, there's even, less spacing. So it's just, the Warriors are the Warriors. They have their own biases towards guys who, quote, play the Warriors way, play light years ball and, cut and pass off the ball really quickly. Butler can assimilate into all that, but again, the math has been catching up to the Warriors for quite some time. And the math is like, you need guys who can really, really shoot. You do. The Warriors have never been a good rebounding team. They're not going to be a great rebounding team now with Butler. They've been a good defensive team. They'll remain a good defensive team, but it would take some very special chemistry between Butler, Green, and Steph to, I think, become the two-way force that would vault them into title contention. I don't think it's going to happen this year because I don't think they have the time to get it all together. But Butler's smart enough to maybe surprise me. But next year would be the year they're banking on it. This kind of reminds me of when the Suns traded for Kevin Durant, because I spoke with Trill about that, and we both agreed, like, It's not going to happen this year, in the year in which they traded them, which means you're sort of punting one of the playoff runs for which you're assumedly acquiring this player. I think the Warriors are doing the same thing with Butler. I don't think it can work this quickly. And so now you're really targeting next year when everyone's a year older. And I don't know that Jimmy's going to be able to be durable enough. Maybe he'll be more receptive in Golden State, since he's not going to be the lead dog there, either in the eyes of the organization or in terms of personality, because Draymond will still beat him out there. So maybe he'll fall in line a little bit and play a little bit more. But the durability and the spacing are two things that I still just don't quite think that they've got. But I acknowledge they can find solutions on offense and they will be able to play very good defense. The timing of it is just the biggest thing to me. And by the way, for Miami, that pick this year is top 10 protected. So if it really doesn't come together and Golden State has, ends up with the 14th or 15th or 16th pick, that's a nice little pick for the Heat. I don't, again, maybe you wanted to get more for Jimmy Butler, but at the end of the day, the Heat have Jovic and, possible rookie of the year, Khalil Ware, and Hero's playing well. And, now they've got Wiggins. Uh, they've got they have got some talent there. They're still the Heat. They still don't have anyone that really elevates them out of the middle of the East. But that player was not really going to be part of this package anyway. And truth be told, Butler wasn't really elevating them out of the middle of the East anyway. They had those two incredible playoff runs. One was in the bubble and the other, and they got to the conference finals again, and that was all great, but it certainly made more sense for them to decide that it was time to move on from Jimmy than the Mavs do with Luka. And even then, they had to wait for Jimmy to basically ask out. So I don't really blame the Heat for how they handled any of this. And I think that pick is interesting. The rest of the stuff, I think Wiggins is probably who he is at this point. I don't really think much of Davion Mitchell or Kyle Anderson at this stage of their careers. Um, but at least now they have some clarity and they can try to experiment a little bit more with this Ware Bam front court that I think is super interesting, that had been playing well for the last few weeks since Spo went to it. So that's that one. Let's see. I guess I can talk about the Lavine trade and the Sacramento Kings. Again, this is not going to be in that much detail at all. I'll just say the Kings have pretty purposefully leaned into a lot of offense on their team, because not only did they get Zach Lavine for trading De'Aaron Fox to San Antonio and getting basically 2 seconds from Charlotte, and then 2 first-round picks, a Spurs pick, I believe, and then another one, or maybe they got that pick the Spurs got from the Wolves in the Dillingham trade at the draft. But they also acquired Valanciunas for a couple second-round picks, and they inserted themselves and traded Colby Jones and Alex Len and got Jake LaRavia. So now they have a rotation of Malik Monk, Zach Lavine, DeMar DeRozan, Keegan Murray, Domantas Sabonis, and then off the bench, Jonas Valanciunas, LaRavia, Keon Ellis, and then, my guy, rookie Devin Carter, plus, whatever else they've got. And, that is, if nothing else, that is a very offensively talented group. I like LaRavia in particular in that group because he's 6'8" and has turned himself into a movement shooter and a guy who cuts well, rebounds well. Not an incredible defender, but at 6'8", he doesn't need to be incredible. He just needs to know where to be, which is what he does. And that was sort of his book coming out of Wake Forest. And, that's a real player. That's a rotation player on a good team. It's clear he was, because he was a rotation player on the Grizzlies and he was good for them in his minutes. So they have beefed up their depth, and Valanciunas is still a fine backup center. It's just that there's no defensive spine to this team except when Keon Ellis and like Keegan Murray share the floor. And that isn't going to happen very frequently now. I applaud Lavine for, I think all things being equal, being pretty professional after he made his trade request and playing well. I know he's got his fans. Jack Quantrill is one, and Lavine is a really good scorer. And if they truly run a lot through Sabonis and Monk and Lavine and Murray are really cutting effectively off the ball, then you could have something there, something real and something very difficult to guard. But DeRozan's presence, DeRozan can develop chemistry, but he really develops chemistry with someone as a pick and roll ball handler. He's not a great off-ball mover at his age. He's still a great shot maker. He's still a great clutch player. He can still be a huge weapon, but he is more of an offensive hub kind of guy. And though I think the Kings will be able to score with this, the version of the team that I think would be super difficult to guard would be a team that plays very, 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 very fast with all of these athletes on the floor. Because Monk, Lavine, and Keegan can really go as athletes. And that's what I think would be a real challenge, is if you played through Sabonis and all of his ability to bruise and had all of that off-ball movement. Now, maybe they can start staggering DeRozan and Sabonis and alternating them as hubs. So if you have one of those two on the floor for all 48 minutes, you can revolve a lot of off-ball stuff around them. But that's sort of how I would approach it. And I would try to get Keon Ellis on the floor in place of DeRozan to have another off-ball cutter and spacer and someone who incidentally starts to bring up your defense a little bit. Or you could replace DeRozan with LaRavia for stretches. Or you could have DeRozan play with LaRavia and Ellis and, I don't know, like Monk or something like that. But that to me is the way where they become more viable offensively. The more DeRozan and Sabonis play together, the slower they're going to play, the less effective I believe all that off-ball stuff that they have will be, which is what I think Lavine is best for them. His decision making has never been where he has thrived, but his play finishing is what's special. So you got to weaponize that off-ball play finishing as much as possible, and I think you do that by splitting up DeRozan and Sabonis more. Now, on defense, they're still going to be vulnerable, really vulnerable. But that's always going to be the case for a team that plays Sabonis so many minutes. Unless you have one of the best rim protecting fours in the game, that's going to be really, really hard. And so this is kind of who the Kings are going to be. You don't need to be a title contender in order to have like a very productive, interesting era. I think the Kings can try to keep this core together for a couple years and see where it goes and see if maybe another deal manifests itself to where they can get a bit more balance. But for now, I think it's interesting. I really like that addition of LaRavia. I hope they split DeRozan and Sabonis up more. I think they could be quite fun. I hope we see them in the playoffs. It'd be a fun team. Going to the San Antonio part of this with Fox, more or less a no-brainer for the Spurs. I don't have that much unique to say about this because the Spurs had so many picks that this was sort of a luxury acquisition for them. And I don't really think that they should feel bad about what they gave up. If anything, the real commitment that they made to Fox is in terms of time, because they're going to re-sign Fox. And when you have Wembanyama, there's not going to be a shortage of players who want to play for him. Plenty of guys have voiced a desire to play alongside Victor Wembanyama. And so really, the Spurs were in a position of sort of having their pick of the litter, and the pick they made was Fox. So the only cost that's really there is opportunity costs of maybe it could have been Trae Young, or maybe you could have looked for it more in the draft, or maybe this, maybe that. And so the question is really, what kind of a partner is Fox going to be? Because in Sacramento, Fox built a reputation over the last couple of years of being a real shot maker, not just a driver and finisher, but like a mid-range shot maker, obviously a three-point shot maker, a late game clutch shot maker where he was sort of the guy making decisions at the end of games, and he would lean into ISO ball and all of this and be pretty good at it. Um, I'm interested to see how that role changes alongside Wemby because uh, Wembanyama is so smart and so competitive and so dedicated to winning that I don't think that the version of Fox in Sacramento is the best version alongside Victor. I still think that I at a base level don't want, if I'm a Spurs fan, I don't want to see a lot of late game possessions where Victor is not being weaponized in some respect. And that means like I don't want Victor standing around while Fox does Fox stuff. I don't think that's the best way for them to try to win games. Now, it's still so early in the process that it could go a lot of different ways, but I think that that means that Fox needs to be more comfortable with the ball out of his hands, with him cutting off of Wembanyama, and he needs to be more comfortable explicitly setting up possessions, knowing that the ball is designed to go to Wemby and that this pick and roll that I'm running, and maybe I have a window to hit an 18-footer right now, but I got to hold on to it because it's better if I look for this lob for Wembanyama. You know, something Chris Paul would do, who's currently his teammate. You know, that sort of more patient, deferential player is who I think Fox needs to be. And he might be that down the line. I'm not like writing him off. I'm just saying that that's the sort of maturation process that I am going to need to see. I don't think this like the contender version of the Spurs necessarily is going to be comprised of even like five guys on the current team. I think it's going to turn over a good bit. Um, but I'll say that if you're stacking the Spurs up against the rest of the West, the player that they had to choose to play alongside Victor did need to be a top tier athlete because I like Devin Vassell. He's not a top tier athlete. I like Sohan. He's not a top tier athlete. Steph Castle's really had his moments and he's very tough. He is a top tier sort of pound for pound strength guy because he's exceptionally strong. But in terms of twitch and burst and elevation, he's not a top tier athlete either. And so they needed a guy who could really just bring athletic pressure on both ends. And Fox is that. So it might be nice to imagine some other player being, Wemby's number two. But I think it can work deep into the playoffs with Fox. I just want to acknowledge that he's going to have to change a little bit the way that he plays the game.